What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another Oregon reel fishing video. It has been a long time since I did one of these tackle videos where I show rigs and stuff like that, and actually the last one I did was pre-steelhead fishing. So it was like kind of showing what I was gonna use to catch these fish and target these fish. Now I'm gonna show you what I actually experienced success on. The baits and lures and all the different things that I used to catch fish, down to the pound test of the leader line, main line, size of hooks, jig heads, everything. This is going to be a very detailed video showing exactly what I did to catch not only my first steelhead, but 7 more. So let's get into it. First thing I want to show you is just the general float setup that I use, and this is going to apply for any fish that I caught while float fishing. This is what I did. It's already rigged up, so I'm not going to untie it, but basically the very first thing you're going to do is slide on one of these bobber stops. Right there, as you can see. So you slide on a bobber stop. Next thing that I always do is go ahead and put on a bead. That way the float doesn't, for whatever reason, float and slide past the bobber stop. Next, you're going to want to slide on the float. I've been really getting into these Bow Mac floats, although I use a lot of Danielson and a few other brands. I like to stick with the generally small size, so I believe this one's a 3/8 ounce. I've used all the way down to a quarter and up to a half. So a quarter to a half is like the weight that I've been using. Next, you're going to go ahead and slide on one more bead, just so that your knot here at the weight doesn't get messed up from the float sliding over it too many times. And then with the inline weight, I like to use a 1/4 ounce. So you tie your main line to one side, then your leader line to the other side. So that's just the very basic like float setup that I use. But now I'm going to show you from that what I use to actually catch these fish. So in the low clear water, I actually like to use all the way down to an 8-pound leader line. So for a leader line, I was actually running this 8-pound Maxima Ultra Green. That was actually for, I believe, 4 of my fish. So just a very, very thin leader line, just so that you don't spook the fish. I talked to a lot of different people who were fishing different weights, and they all said, you know, anything over 8 was just spooking the fish, and they weren't catching anything. So I went with 8. And it did result in me losing 1 fish due to it breaking off, but I also landed about 4 more. From that 8-pound leader line, you tie that to the inline weight. And I like to run the leader about 2.5 to 3 feet. And I was running this little Mad River worm on an arrow jig head, 1/16 ounce. And this worm is actually only 3 inches long, a little hot pink with a chartreuse tail. And the spot I was fishing was very deep, so I would set that float about 10 feet deep, and it would just slow drift through, but the fish loved it. So that is the rig that I used for a few of my fish in those low clear water situations. But now I'm going to go back to what I actually caught my first steelhead on. And this was a very interesting rig. So that first fish I actually caught when the water was a little higher. That one was not caught in low water like most of my fish were. So the gear we were fishing was all a little bit heavier and a little bit different. First of all, I was actually fishing a 15-pound leader line, which was a lot heavier, but when the water's high enough, fish really don't see your leader line, and it's not as important. Like, I've seen guys run, you know, 15, 17-pound leader line pretty effectively, and it really just helps you kind of horse the fish in a way, to make sure you're actually landing these fish, you know. A lot of times you're pulling them in heavy current, and you got to be able to really pull on them. The first part of this rig is the 15-pound leader line, again Maxima, tied to a 1/8 ounce addicted jig, a little addicted nightmare jig with a chartreuse head. So a slightly heavier jig and a brighter head because the water was a little murky. It wasn't muddy, but it wasn't low. I then scented that jig with Anise Bloody Tuna Super Gel, which I was told afterwards that gel isn't the best for jigs. You want to use oils, but this actually got the job done. And then the other thing I did with this rig is I took my leader line and I tied it directly to the hook of that jig, just like I'm doing right now. A lot of people were fishing what's called a double bead setup at that time, so I figured I'm gonna do roughly the same thing, but instead of 2 beads, I'm gonna do a jig and a bead. So I had that jig, and then again, like a couple feet of leader line, and then I just tied a standard bead knot, where you just go through it a couple times here. Tied that hook on. Yeah, and then the end result was, again, that little addicted jig scented with the bloody tuna scent. A couple feet of leader line to my bead, which was the same exact bead, little 10 millimeter pink bead, and that fish actually came on the bead. So just a double setup, jig, 2 feet of leader line to a bead, and that got the job done for my first ever steelhead. The next fish I caught that was actually my biggest steelhead of the year came on a size 4 blue fox spinner, blue with silver blade. Not gonna dive too deep into this rig because it's really simple. It's just I was using, again, 8-pound leader line. It was low clear water tied directly to the spinner, and then just reeling it just fast enough to get the blade spinning. You really don't want to reel it too fast to where it's just on top of the water. You want to get it down to where the fish are at, and that got it done. That was definitely my biggest steelhead of the year. My third fish was also caught on a very simple rig, but effective. This was a little 1/16 ounce nightmare jig. Again, tied to 8-pound leader line on that float setup, caught in low clear water. That was actually my first jig fish, and I would definitely recommend these little nightmare jigs from Addicted Fishing. My next 2 fish that I caught were in that sort of frog water, caught on the pink and chartreuse tail worm, 16th ounce jig head. Again, just tied to that 8-pound Maxima under that float setup. But the next rig I'm going to show you was something new to me that I had never tried, but it turned out to be very effective. So the next time I went out to the river that I usually like to fish when it's around 5 feet, it was actually at 9 feet. It was just after the rain, so I knew that, you know, the techniques I'd been fishing weren't going to cut it on that day, and decided I was going to try drift fishing for the first time. Drift fishing, you're basically fishing a lead weight on the bottom with whatever bait you would normally fish under a float. A lot of people like to drift fish beads or corkies and yarn. The very basic rig is just a little snap swivel. Phil, straighten up here. Okay, so on this side you have your main line tied to the first loop there, and then your leader line on the other loop, and with that little snap swivel, this is a little piece of pencil lead that you just clamp down, poke a hole in it, slide it right on, and you can clip it to whatever length that you want. And you're gonna want it heavy enough to get down to the bottom, but not so heavy that it's just sitting in one place. And then from there, fished about 3 feet of leader line to, again, the hot pink worm, chartreuse tail. Only this time I was fishing it on a much heavier jig head. This was a 1/8 ounce jig head instead of a 16th, and that's what I caught my first native steelhead on. One of my favorite catches this year for sure. And lastly, the last rig that I used to catch my 8th steelhead of the year, I was actually using that same drift fishing setup, only instead of fishing a worm, I was fishing a very, very small red jig that I had found at a little local tackle place around where I was fishing, and I actually lost that jig since then, but it was very similar to this guy right here. This is a little red addicted jig. The one I was fishing was a little smaller. It was actually a 1/32 ounce, so it was micro, but just on that same drift fishing rig. 12-pound leader line for that, since the water was a little higher. Now real quick, I'm gonna go over the rods and reels I was using all season long, just for anyone who's curious, and I'll give a quick review on those. This is my caster. I've been using this as a float rod all season long. Here I have a Daiwa Tatula casting reel. I picked this reel because it's got a really deep spool, so lots of line capacity. So even though the max drag is only about 12.5 pounds on this one, holds a ton of line, and that's going to help you with landing fish. And then the rod is an Okuma Sst 10'6" caster, rated for 10 to 20 pound line, 3/8 to 1.5 ounce lure rating. And again, I use this as my float rod. I love the sensitivity on it, and I love the length. But mostly, I like a casting reel because it's easier to let line out when you're just letting that float go downstream. It's easier to just click the button, let some line come out, instead of you know, fidgeting with the spinning reel, trying to pull line out, and it gets tricky with the spinning reel, in my opinion. It's a very controversial topic, but leave a comment down below if you prefer a caster or spinning reel for float fishing. Total cost for that setup was, I believe, $189 for the reel and $159 for the rod. I did get them discounted, but brand new, it's going to be a little under a $400 setup. So that's where most of my money went, and this one is actually one I already had. I've been using for surf fishing, cove fishing, pretty much anything other than bass fishing I would use this one for. And this is just a little Okuma X Precision combo. It's like a bottom of the line Okuma combo, plastic reel, cheap rod. I think $60 for the combo. I mean, it really doesn't get cheaper than this, but caught more than half my fish on it this year. And this rod's just an 8.6, 8 to 17 pound. I use 30-pound Power Pro braid on both these reels, by the way. And this one has been good for throwing spinners and drift fishing because the shorter length, there's better sensitivity on it for drift fishing. Even though it is a cheap rod and reel, it's just come in clutch and really helped me land a lot of fish this year. And not only that, it's just good to have two rods to be able to have two different techniques, two different baits, throw a couple different things, you know, without having to retie. Yeah, that is going to do it for this video. That is, you know, as detailed as I'm going to get today. That is all the gear I used to catch my first 8 steelhead. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. But for now, that is going to do it. I'll see you guys on the next one.